Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Episodes. Before we dive into today's incredible tale, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And if you enjoy this content, give us a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. Today's story is absolutely wild. It's about corruption, harassment, federal crimes, and two very protective German shepherds. This is the story of Ezra Thornton versus the HOA president from hell. Let's get into it. Our story begins with Ezra Thornton, a man who had given 22 years of his life to the United States military. Ezra wasn't just any service member. He was military police, the kind of guy who investigated crimes, maintained order on base, and dealt with everything from theft to serious security breaches. After 2 decades of deployments, late nights, and the constant weight of responsibility, Ezra decided it was time to retire and focus on his family. His wife, Carmen, was no less impressive. She worked as a trauma nurse at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, spending her days helping veterans cope with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and the invisible wounds of war. Between Ezra's military service and Carmen's work with veterans, they understood sacrifice, discipline, and the importance of community.
They had twin daughters, 8-year-old girls named Sophie and Emma, who were bright, energetic, and deserved a stable home where they could grow up safely. And then there were Rex and Luna, 2 retired military working dogs, German shepherds who had served alongside Ezra during his deployments. These weren't just pets. They were highly trained, loyal, and still had that edge that made them exceptional protectors. After months of searching, Ezra and Carmen found what seemed like the perfect place, Willowbrook Estates. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets, spacious yards, and a community pool. The homes were well maintained, the schools nearby had good ratings, and most importantly, there was plenty of space for Rex and Luna to run around. The neighborhood had a reputation for being family-friendly, and several residents were veterans themselves, which made Ezra and Carmen feel like they'd finally found their place. Moving day arrived on a bright Saturday morning in early spring. Ezra and Carmen were directing the movers, boxes were piling up in the garage, and the girls were already exploring the backyard with Rex and Luna. Everything seemed perfect, until she showed up, Bethany Crow. She came striding across the lawn like she owned the entire neighborhood, which, in her mind, she probably did. Bethany was in her mid-50s, impeccably dressed in designer athleisure wear that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was styled in that severe bob that screamed, "I demand to speak to your manager," and her expression was already twisted into disapproval before she even reached their driveway. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that was somehow both saccharine and condescending. "I'm Bethany Crow, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I don't believe you've submitted your move-in paperwork." Ezra, who was carrying a heavy box of kitchen supplies, set it down and extended his hand politely. "Ezra Thornton, nice to meet you. We just got the keys yesterday, so we haven't had a chance to look into the HOA stuff yet. I'm sure we'll get everything sorted out this week." Bethany ignored his hand entirely, her eyes instead scanning the yard where Rex and Luna were playing with the girls. Her lip curled slightly. "Those are large dogs. I'll need to see proof of registration, vaccination records, and breed certification. We have very strict pet policies here." Carmen, who had just walked out of the house, picked up on the tension immediately. "They're retired military working dogs," she said calmly. "They're fully trained, well-behaved, and they're family. I'm happy to provide whatever documentation you need." "Military working dogs," Bethany repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "How interesting. I'll also need to inspect your backyard setup. I noticed what appears to be some kind of obstacle course equipment. That will need to be removed immediately. It's not consistent with our neighborhood aesthetic." Ezra's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "That equipment is therapeutic. Rex and Luna need physical and mental stimulation. It's part of their post-service care." "I don't care what it's for," Bethany snapped, her pleasant facade cracking. "This is a family neighborhood, not a military base. We have standards here, and I intend to enforce them. You'll be receiving a formal notice within 48 hours. I suggest you comply, or there will be consequences." And with that, she turned on her designer sneakers and marched back to her house, which, Ezra noticed, was the largest one on the block and sat directly across the street from theirs. Carmen looked at Ezra, her expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Did that just happen?" "Yeah," Ezra replied quietly, watching Bethany disappear into her house. "It did. Something tells me this is going to be a problem."
Within 24 hours, not the promised 48, a formal violation notice appeared in their mailbox. It was printed on official-looking HOA letterhead and cited multiple infractions: unauthorized pet structures, excessive noise from animals, non-approved exterior modifications, and failure to submit proper move-in documentation. The fines listed at the bottom totaled $850. Ezra read the notice 3 times, his military-trained mind immediately identifying the problems. First, they'd only been in the house for 1 day. There was no way there had been time to properly assess any violations. Second, Rex and Luna barely barked. Calling them noisy was absurd. Third, the therapeutic equipment in the backyard had been there when they moved in, left by the previous owners who had also used it for their dogs. This wasn't about violations. This was personal. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated. Another violation notice arrived, this time claiming that their trash bins were visible from the street, even though they were in the exact same spot as every other house on the block. Then came a notice about their mailbox being non-regulation, even though it was identical to their neighbors. Then a complaint about their lawn being inadequately maintained, despite the fact that Ezra had just spent 3 hours mowing and edging it to perfection. Each notice came with escalating fines. Each one was signed by Bethany Crow, HOA President. Carmen started keeping a detailed log of every notice, photographing their property to document that they were in full compliance with any reasonable standards. Ezra, meanwhile, started doing what he did best: investigating. He knocked on neighbors' doors, introducing himself and casually asking about the HOA. What he discovered was disturbing. Most residents admitted they were afraid of Bethany. Several told stories of being harassed over minor issues, of receiving fines that seemed arbitrary and excessive. One elderly veteran, a man named Harold who lived 3 houses down, pulled Ezra aside and warned him. "She goes after military families especially," Harold said quietly, glancing toward Bethany's house as if she might be listening. "You're the 4th family in 3 years. She finds ways to make their lives miserable until they sell and leave. I don't know why she does it, but I've seen it happen. Be careful." That conversation changed everything for Ezra. This wasn't just a personality conflict or a power-hungry HOA president. This was targeted harassment, and it was part of a pattern. Bethany's campaign against the Thornton family intensified in ways that were both creative and disturbing. The violation notices continued to pile up, but now she was branching out into tactics that were designed to damage their reputation and isolate them from the community. It started with the noise complaints. Bethany filed formal complaints with the county, alleging that Rex and Luna were causing excessive disturbance at all hours of the day and night. She claimed they barked constantly, frightened children, and created a hostile environment. Animal control showed up at their door twice in 1 week. Both times, the officers were apologetic. They could see immediately that Rex and Luna were well-trained, calm, and certainly not the menaces described in the complaints. One officer even recognized them as retired military working dogs and thanked Ezra for his service. But the complaints created a paper trail, which was exactly what Bethany wanted. Then came the Child Protective Services visit.
Carmen was home alone with the girls when the CPS caseworker arrived, clipboard in hand, explaining that they'd received an anonymous report claiming that dangerous animals were being kept in a home with young children, that the children were being exposed to military training exercises, and that there were concerns about their safety and well-being. Carmen, who had dealt with bureaucracy her entire nursing career, remained calm and professional. She walked the caseworker through their home, showed her the girls' rooms, introduced her to Rex and Luna, and explained their background. The caseworker spent an hour there and ultimately closed the case immediately, noting that the complaint was clearly unfounded and possibly malicious. But the damage had been done. Sophie and Emma had been terrified when they saw the CPS worker, asking their mom if they were in trouble, if someone was going to take them away. Carmen held them that night as they cried, and Ezra felt a cold rage building inside him. This had crossed a line. The final straw came when the girls came home from school in tears. Other kids had been saying things, terrible things about their family, about their dogs, about their dad being dangerous because he was in the military. The rumors had spread through the school like wildfire, and Sophie and Emma had gone from being excited about making new friends to being isolated and bullied. Ezra did some digging and discovered that Bethany had been attending PTA meetings even though she had no children in the school system, and had been spreading carefully worded concerns about the unstable military family that had moved into the neighborhood. She never said anything actionable, just planted seeds of doubt and fear. That night, Ezra and Carmen sat at their kitchen table, exhausted and frustrated. They had done nothing wrong, yet their family was being systematically torn apart by one person's vendetta. "We need to fight back," Carmen said quietly, "but we need to be smart about it." Ezra nodded. "Agreed, and I know exactly where to start."
Perhaps the most valuable was this: documentation and evidence win battles. Emotions don't. Anger doesn't. Cold, hard proof does. He started by investing in a professional-grade security system for their property. He installed cameras at every entrance, covering the front door, back door, both sides of the house, the garage, and the backyard. These weren't cheap consumer cameras. These were high-resolution systems with night vision, motion detection, and audio recording capabilities. Everything was stored both locally and in the cloud. Next, he created a comprehensive evidence folder. Every single violation notice Bethany had sent, every photograph of their property showing compliance, every email and interaction, every visit from animal control or CPS, it all went into organized files with dates, times, and detailed notes. Carmen, with her background in healthcare administration, took on the financial investigation. She requested copies of the HOA's financial records, bylaws, and meeting minutes, all documents that, according to Virginia state law, had to be made available to homeowners. It took Bethany 2 weeks and multiple formal requests to provide them, which was already a violation of the law. When the documents finally arrived, Carmen spread them across their dining room table and started going through them line by line. What she found made her stomach turn. The HOA's financial records were a mess. Transactions were poorly documented, expenses were vaguely described, and there were regular payments going to companies that Carmen couldn't identify. She started cross-referencing business names with Virginia's corporate database and discovered that several of the vendors the HOA was paying didn't exist or were registered to addresses that led nowhere. "Ezra," she called from the dining room one evening, "you need to see this." Ezra walked in to find Carmen surrounded by papers, her laptop open, and a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "What did you find?" "Bethany's been embezzling HOA funds," Carmen said flatly. "Look at this. Every month there are payments to Willowbrook Maintenance Services for lawn care and general upkeep. But I talked to Harold and he said the actual landscaping company is called Green Thumb Landscaping. So I looked up Willowbrook Maintenance Services." She turned her laptop around to show Ezra. "It's registered to a P.O. box. The registered agent? Bethany Crow." Ezra leaned in, studying the screen. "She's paying herself."
Not just for that, Carmen continued. There's also neighborhood management solutions, community safety consulting, and property standards enforcement LLC. I tracked them all. Every single one is a shell company registered to Bethany or her husband. She's been funneling HOA dues, money from every homeowner in this neighborhood, into her own pocket for at least 3 years. Ezra felt that familiar sense of focus that came when a case started coming together. How much are we talking? Carmen pulled up a spreadsheet. Conservative estimate, $70,000 to $90,000. That's felony embezzlement, Ezra said quietly. Yes, it is, Carmen agreed. But there's more. I went back through the bylaws and the articles of incorporation for the HOA. Ezra, I don't think this HOA is even legally valid anymore. The management contract expired 18 months ago and was never renewed. There hasn't been a properly noticed election in 4 years. And according to the bylaws, the HOA board is supposed to have 5 members. Bethany is the only one. The others all resigned, and no replacements were elected. Ezra sat down heavily. So she's been operating an illegitimate HOA, collecting fees that residents aren't legally obligated to pay, and embezzling the money. Exactly, Carmen said, and issuing fake fines that have no legal standing whatsoever.
With Carmen's financial discoveries, Ezra started digging deeper into Bethany's background and connections. What he found was even more disturbing than simple embezzlement. He started by looking into the 3 previous military families that Harold had mentioned, the ones who had been driven out of the neighborhood. Ezra tracked down their information through public property records and social media, and he started making phone calls. The first family he reached was the Johnsons, a Marine Corps family who had lived in Willowbrook Estates for less than a year before selling their home and moving across the state. Captain Marcus Johnson was still on active duty, and when Ezra explained who he was and what was happening, Marcus didn't hesitate to share his story. "It was a nightmare," Marcus said over the phone. "The HOA president, Bethany something, she made our lives hell from the moment we moved in. Constant violations, harassment, complaints to the county. My wife was in tears half the time. We finally just gave up and sold. We took a loss on the house because we needed to get out fast." "Do you remember who bought your house?" Ezra asked. There was a pause. "Actually, yeah, it was some real estate investment company. They made us a cash offer below market value, but we were desperate. The company was called Pinnacle Property Investments, I think." Ezra wrote down the name. "Did you ever see Bethany again after you sold?" "Funny you should ask," Marcus said. "I drove by the house a few months later and I saw her standing in the driveway talking to some guy in a suit. It seemed weird, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Ezra thanked him and moved on to the next family. The story was almost identical. So was the third. Each military family had been harassed relentlessly by Bethany, had sold their homes at a loss to escape the situation, and had sold to the same real estate investment company, Pinnacle Property Investments. Ezra started researching the company. Pinnacle Property Investments was a Virginia-based LLC that specialized in buying undervalued properties, making minor renovations, and flipping them for profit. It was a perfectly legal business model unless you were deliberately driving down property values through harassment and creating the opportunities to buy low. He pulled up the property records for the 3 homes that had belonged to the military families. Each one had been purchased by Pinnacle for 15 to 25% below market value. Each one had been resold within 6 months for a significant profit. But the real bombshell came when Ezra looked up Pinnacle's corporate filings and ownership structure. The company was owned by a holding company, which was owned by another holding company, but when he finally traced the ownership chain back to its source, he found a name he recognized: Richard Crowe, Bethany's husband. Ezra sat back in his chair, the full scope of the scheme finally coming into focus.
Bethany wasn't just a petty tyrant on a power trip. She was running an organized real estate fraud operation. She targeted military families, people who were often under stress, frequently relocating, and less likely to fight back against bureaucratic harassment. She made their lives miserable until they agreed to sell. Then her husband's company swooped in with a lowball cash offer that the desperate families accepted. Pinnacle then flipped the properties for maximum profit. It was brilliant in a criminal sort of way, and it was completely illegal.
Building the coalition. With the evidence mounting, Ezra knew it was time to bring in professional help. He contacted an attorney named Patricia Mills, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer who specialized in real estate law and HOA disputes. Patricia had a reputation for taking on corrupt HOAs and winning. Ezra and Carmen met with her at her office, bringing boxes of documents, financial records, and their detailed timeline of harassment. Patricia spent 2 hours reviewing everything, occasionally looking up with raised eyebrows as particularly egregious details emerged. Finally, she set down the last document and looked at them. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases of HOA fraud I've ever seen," she said. "You've done incredible work documenting all of this. The harassment is clear, the embezzlement is provable, and the real estate scheme is the icing on the cake." "So we can take her down?" Ezra asked. We can do better than that," Patricia said with a slight smile. "We can dismantle her entire operation and make sure she faces real consequences. But we need to be strategic. First, we're going to file a complaint with the Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation because Bethany has been operating an illegitimate HOA and collecting fees under false pretenses. Second, we're going to report the embezzlement to the local police. Third, and this is the big one, we're going to contact the FBI. "The FBI?" Carmen asked. Patricia nodded. "The real estate scheme crosses into federal territory for several reasons. First, there's wire fraud. She's been using electronic banking and communications to carry out the scheme. Second, there's potential housing discrimination because she's specifically targeting military families. That's a violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act and potentially the Fair Housing Act. The FBI's White-Collar Crime Division will be very interested in this." She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "But before we go to the authorities, we need to solidify the community support. Bethany has operated through fear and intimidation. If we can show that the entire neighborhood is united against her, it makes our case stronger and prevents her from retaliating against individual residents." Ezra understood immediately. "You want to organize the neighbors." "Exactly," Patricia said. "Call a community meeting, present the evidence, show them that the HOA is illegitimate, that their dues have been stolen, and that they don't have to be afraid of her anymore. Once you have the community on your side, Bethany's power evaporates." Over the next 2 weeks, Ezra and Carmen went door to door, talking to neighbors. They started with Harold and the other veterans in the neighborhood, people they knew would be sympathetic. The response was overwhelming. Nearly everyone had a story about Bethany's harassment, her arbitrary fines, her intimidation tactics. Several residents were still paying monthly HOA dues because they were afraid of what would happen if they stopped. They organized a community meeting at the neighborhood pool clubhouse, sending formal notices to every household. The notice was carefully worded. Community discussion regarding HOA management and financial transparency. They didn't mention Bethany in name, but everyone knew what it was about. The night before the meeting, Ezra's security cameras picked up something interesting. Bethany was seen walking around their property at 11 p.m., shining a flashlight into their windows and yard. She was clearly looking for something, any violation, any evidence she could use against them. Rex and Luna, ever vigilant, watched her from inside the house but didn't bark on Ezra's command. He wanted this on camera. The footage would prove useful very soon. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at 3 p.m. By Friday night, Ezra had heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Bethany was panicking. She'd sent threatening emails to several residents, warning them not to attend the meeting, claiming it was illegal and not authorized by the HOA board. Some residents were intimidated, but most were angry enough at this point to show up anyway. What Ezra didn't expect was for Bethany to make a move the night before the meeting. It was 3:30 in the morning when the motion sensors on Ezra's security system activated, sending an alert to his phone. He woke immediately, years of military training making him alert within seconds. He checked the camera feeds and felt his blood run cold. Bethany was in their backyard. She wasn't alone. A man Ezra didn't recognize was with her, carrying what looked like a duffel bag. They were moving toward the shed at the back of the property, the one where Ezra kept tools, lawn equipment, and some of Rex and Luna's training gear. Ezra watched as Bethany pulled out a key, a master key, likely the one she'd kept from when she'd been on the HOA board, and tried to unlock the shed. It didn't work. Ezra had changed all the locks when they'd moved in. The man with her pulled out a small crowbar and started working on the door. Within 30 seconds, they were inside. Ezra was already moving. He pulled on pants and a shirt, then made a decision. He opened the bedroom door, and Rex and Luna immediately came to attention. They'd heard the commotion outside and were waiting for commands. "Rex, Luna, come," Ezra said quietly. The dogs fell in beside him as he moved downstairs. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping his voice low and calm as he reported a burglary in progress at his address. Then he armed himself, not with a firearm, though he had them, but with his phone set to record video and a high-powered flashlight. He moved to the back door, Rex and Luna at his heels, their training making them silent and focused. Through the window, Ezra could see Bethany and her accomplice still in the shed, their flashlights moving around. He activated the backyard floodlights, bright LED lights that lit up the entire yard like a stadium. Bethany and the man froze, caught like deer in headlights. Ezra opened the back door and stepped out, Rex and Luna flanking him. The two German shepherds didn't bark, didn't growl, but their presence was unmistakable. 90 pounds of muscle and training, focused and ready. "That's far enough," Ezra called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "The police are on their way. I suggest you stay exactly where you are." Bethany's face was a mask of rage and panic. "This is HOA property. I have every right to inspect." "You're trespassing," Ezra interrupted, "and I have video evidence of you breaking in. Now, we can wait here together for the police, or you can try to leave and make this worse for yourself. Your choice." The man with Bethany, Ezra guessed it was her husband Richard, dropped the duffel bag and started backing toward the fence. "Bethany, we need to go, now." "Don't move," commanded Ezra. Rex and Luna shifted slightly, their attention zeroing in on Richard. He froze. The sound of sirens grew louder. Within 2 minutes, police cruisers were pulling up in front of the house and officers were coming around to the backyard. Ezra called Rex and Luna to his side, giving the officers clear access. One of the officers approached Ezra first. "You're the homeowner?" "Yes, sir. Ezra Thornton. These two broke into my shed. I have video evidence from multiple angles." The officer's expression hardened. He turned to his partner. "Cuff them." Bethany exploded. "This is outrageous. I'm the HOA president. I have every authority to inspect properties for violations. This is a setup." "Ma'am, you need to calm down," the officer said firmly. "You're being arrested for trespassing and breaking and entering. You have the right to remain silent." As the officers read their rights, Ezra walked to the shed and looked at what Bethany and Richard had been doing. The duffel bag they'd brought was open, and inside were several items that made Ezra's blood boil. Ammunition boxes labeled in Arabic, printed materials about explosives, and what looked like extremist literature. They'd been trying to plant evidence. They were going to frame him as some kind of domestic terrorist to discredit him before the community meeting. Ezra carefully didn't touch anything, instead calling the officers over. "You're going to want to document this very carefully. This is evidence of attempted evidence planting." One of the officers photographed everything while his partner called for a detective. This had just escalated from simple trespassing to something much more serious. By the time the sun came up, Ezra and Carmen's house had become a crime scene, in a good way. Detectives had arrived, photographed everything, taken statements, and seized the materials Bethany and Richard had tried to plant. Bethany and Richard were in jail, charged with trespassing, breaking and entering, and attempted evidence tampering. But that was just the beginning.
Patricia Mills, their attorney, arrived at 8 a.m. after Ezra called her with an update. She listened to the whole story, reviewed the video footage, and made a phone call that would change everything. "I have a contact at the FBI's Richmond field office," she explained to Ezra and Carmen. "Given the attempted framing, the targeting of a veteran, and the existing evidence of the real estate fraud scheme, I think they'll want to take over this investigation. Are you comfortable with that?" "Absolutely," Ezra said without hesitation. By noon, 2 FBI agents were sitting in Ezra and Carmen's living room. Special Agent Jennifer Marks was a specialist in white-collar crime, while Special Agent David Chen focused on civil rights violations. They spent 3 hours going through everything: the harassment timeline, the financial records, the real estate scheme, the attempted break-in, and all the video evidence. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Thornton," Agent Marks said when they'd finished, "this is one of the most well-documented cases I've seen in my career. You've essentially done half our investigation for us. With your permission, we'd like to move forward with a full federal investigation into Mrs. Crow, her husband, and Pinnacle Property Investments." "You have our full cooperation," Carmen said. Lane Chen leaned forward. "We're also going to need to interview the other military families who were targeted. Based on what you've shown us, there's a clear pattern of discrimination against service members, which is a federal civil rights violation. Combined with the wire fraud, bank fraud, and embezzlement, the Crows are looking at serious federal charges." "What happens now?" Ezra asked. "Now," Agent Marks smiled slightly, "now we do what we do best. We're going to execute search warrants on the Crows' home, their business offices, and their financial records. We're going to freeze their assets, and we're going to build a case that ensures they face the consequences of their actions." "What about the meeting tomorrow? People are expecting us to present evidence and discuss what's been happening." Agent Marks considered this. "Actually, I think the meeting should go forward. In fact, I'd like to attend. It would be useful to hear from other residents who may have information or evidence we haven't discovered yet. And," she paused, "it might be useful for the community to see that the federal government takes this kind of fraud and discrimination seriously." Ezra and Carmen exchanged looks. This was really happening. Afternoon arrived, with beautiful weather and an unusual amount of tension in the Willowbrook Estates neighborhood. By 2:30 p.m., the pool clubhouse was packed with residents, easily 70 or 80 people, far more than had ever attended an HOA meeting before. Ezra and Carmen arrived early to set up. They had a projector ready to display their evidence, copies of key documents for residents to review, and a clear agenda for the meeting. Patricia Mills was there as their attorney, and true to her word, Special Agent Marks was present as well, sitting quietly in the back. At exactly 3 p.m., Ezra called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I know many of you are aware that there have been some issues with the HOA management lately. What you might not know is the full extent of what's been happening. Over the past few months, my family has been systematically harassed by Bethany Crow. We initially thought it was just a personality conflict, but as we investigated, we discovered something much more serious." He pulled up the first slide on the projector, a timeline of all the violation notices, fake complaints, and harassment incidents. The room was silent as people read through it. "Bethany has been targeting military families specifically. We're the 4th family in 3 years to be harassed until we considered selling and leaving. But we started asking why. And what we found is a criminal conspiracy involving HOA fraud, embezzlement, and real estate manipulation." Carmen took over, pulling up the financial records. "The HOA has been paying thousands of dollars per month to companies that don't actually exist. These are shell companies owned by Bethany and her husband. Over the past 3 years, they've embezzled somewhere between $70,000 and $90,000 from our community dues." The room erupted in angry murmurs. Several people called out questions. "How is that possible? Why didn't anyone notice?" Patricia Mills stood up. "I can answer that. Bethany has been operating an illegitimate HOA. The management contract expired 18 months ago. There hasn't been a properly elected board in 4 years. Legally speaking, the HOA has no authority to collect dues or enforce violations. Every fine she's issued, every fee she's collected, has been done under false pretenses." The murmurs turned into outright anger. Harold, the elderly veteran, stood up.
I've paid over $6,000 in dues and fines in the past 2 years. Are you telling me I didn't legally owe any of it? That's exactly what I'm telling you, and you're not alone. Bethany has defrauded this entire community. Ezra pulled up the next set of slides, showing the connection to Pinnacle property investments and the pattern of targeting military families. He explained how the scheme worked: harassment leading to panic sales, below-market purchases, quick flips for profit. This isn't just about money. This is about targeting people who served their country, exploiting them when they're vulnerable, and destroying the sense of community that should exist in a neighborhood like this. A woman in the third row raised her hand. When Ezra nodded to her, she stood up. I'm Maria Henderson. My husband is active duty Army. When we first moved here 2 years ago, Bethany tried the same tactics on us: constant violations, harassment, threats. We almost left, but my husband got deployed and we were locked into our mortgage. The harassment stopped after he deployed, probably because she knew we couldn't sell while he was overseas. But now I'm realizing we weren't paranoid. This was real. It was absolutely real, and you weren't the only ones. We've documented similar patterns with multiple families. It was at this moment that the door to the clubhouse opened. Everyone turned to look. Bethany Crow walked in.
Bethany had made bail that morning. Richard's family had posted bond for both of them, and she'd clearly decided that her best defense was a strong offense. She strode into the meeting like she owned the place, which in her mind she probably still did. "This is an unauthorized meeting," she announced loudly. "As HOA President, I'm shutting this down immediately. You are all in violation of community bylaws by gathering without proper notice and—" "Sit down, Mrs. Crow," Patricia Mills interrupted. "You have no authority here." Bethany's face reddened. "I most certainly do. I am the elected president of this HOA, and I demand—" "You were never legally elected," Patricia said calmly, standing up with a document in her hand. "The last legitimate election in this community was 4 years ago, and you weren't even a candidate in that election. You appointed yourself president after the previous board members resigned, and you've been operating without legal authority ever since." Bethany's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She recovered quickly, her expression shifting to indignation. "That's absurd. I have documentation of my election. You have forged documents," Ezra interrupted. "We've compared your supposed election records with the county records. The dates don't match, the signatures don't match, and several of the people you claim voted for you have stated under oath that they never participated in any election." The room had gone completely silent. Every eye was on Bethany, and her composure was starting to crack. "This is a conspiracy," she said, her voice rising. "You're all turning against me because I've tried to maintain standards in this neighborhood. I've worked tirelessly to keep property values high, to keep this community safe, and—" "You've stolen $90,000. Carmen said flatly. "You've harassed military families. You and your husband have manipulated property sales for personal profit. And last night, you broke into our property and attempted to plant fake evidence to frame my husband as a terrorist." Bethany's face went pale. "That's a lie. I was conducting a legitimate HOA inspection at 3:30 in the morning. Breaking into a locked shed with a crowbar, carrying planted evidence? Mrs. Crow, I have high-definition video of the entire incident. The police have the evidence you tried to plant. Your husband has already given a statement." "Richard wouldn't—" Bethany started, then stopped herself. It was at this moment that Special Agent Marks stood up from the back of the room. She held up her FBI credentials. "Bethany Crow, I'm Special Agent Jennifer Marks with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm here to inform you that federal search warrants were executed on your home and business offices this morning. We've seized your financial records, computers, and documents related to Pinnacle Property Investments." The color drained completely from Bethany's face. Agent Marks continued, her voice professional and measured. "You are currently under investigation for wire fraud, bank fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, housing discrimination in violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, and attempted evidence tampering. I strongly suggest you contact your attorney and refrain from making any further statements."
Bethany looked around the room wildly, searching for support, for sympathy, for anything. She found only cold stares and angry faces. These were her neighbors, people she'd intimidated, harassed, and stolen from for years, and now they all knew the truth. "You don't understand," Bethany said, her voice breaking. "I built this community. I maintained the standards. I kept the undesirables out. I kept property values high. Everything I did was for the good of your bank account," Harold said, standing up. His voice shook with anger. "I'm a 72-year-old veteran, Bethany. I'm on a fixed income, and you've been bleeding me dry with fake fines and illegal dues for years. You targeted me because you knew I couldn't fight back. You're not a community leader. You're a thief and a bully." Other voices joined in. Person after person stood up and shared their stories. The violations that made no sense, the fines that seemed arbitrary, the intimidation, the fear. It was like a dam had broken, and years of pent-up frustration came flooding out. Bethany stood there, frozen, as the community she'd terrorized for so long turned against her. Finally, she turned and fled from the clubhouse, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste to escape. The room was silent for a moment after she left. Then someone started clapping, then another person, then another. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, not for Bethany's exit, but for the courage it had taken to stand up to her.
Whirlwind of legal activity. The FBI's investigation moved quickly, aided by the comprehensive evidence Ezra and Carmen had already compiled. Search warrants executed on the Crow's home and offices yielded even more damning evidence. Investigators found emails between Bethany and Richard explicitly discussing their scheme to target military families. They found detailed financial records showing exactly how much money had been embezzled and how it had been funneled through the shell companies. They found records of the properties Pinnacle had purchased at below-market rates and the substantial profits made when they were quickly resold. Perhaps most damning, they found Bethany's personal journal. In it, she documented her strategies for harassing families, noting which tactics were most effective at making people desperate enough to sell. She'd actually written things like increase violation notices to weekly frequency and file CPS report to increase pressure on mother. It was a blueprint for targeted harassment written in her own hand. The other 3 military families that had been driven from the neighborhood were contacted by the FBI and gave detailed statements about their experiences. Captain Marcus Johnson, the Marine officer who had sold his house at a loss, was particularly helpful. He provided emails and documentation showing how Bethany had intensified her harassment campaign right when his deployment was imminent, knowing that his wife would be dealing with everything alone. The local police department was embarrassed to discover that Bethany had filed dozens of false reports over the years, noise complaints, animal control complaints, even accusations of domestic disturbances, all designed to create a paper trail against her targets. They'd responded to each call in good faith, never realizing they were being manipulated as weapons in Bethany's scheme. The Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation opened its own investigation into the illegitimate HOA operations. They discovered that Bethany had been issuing violations and collecting fines not just in Willowbrook Estates, but in 2 other neighborhoods where she'd managed to insert herself into HOA leadership positions. The scope of her fraud was even larger than initially believed. Meanwhile, the Willowbrook Estates community was working to rebuild. Patricia Mills helped organize a legitimate HOA election, properly noticed and conducted according to Virginia law. Harold, the elderly veteran, was elected president by a unanimous vote. The new board immediately voted to refund all dues that had been collected during Bethany's illegitimate reign, money that would come from the eventual restitution payments Bethany would be ordered to make. Carmen took on the task of working with a forensic accountant to trace every dollar that had been embezzled. The final tally was devastating. Over $115,000 stolen from community dues, plus another $40,000 in fake fines that residents had paid out of fear. The accountant also discovered that Bethany had been skimming from the community pool's maintenance fund, which explained why the pool had fallen into disrepair despite regular maintenance payments on the books. For Ezra and Carmen, life slowly started to return to normal. The harassment stopped, obviously, but more than that, the neighborhood embraced their family.
Neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak to them before now stopped by with casseroles and offers to help. Sophie and Emma made friends at school, and the bullying that had plagued them disappeared once the truth about Bethany's rumor-mongering came out. Rex and Luna enjoyed their therapeutic equipment in peace, and Ezra even started a volunteer program teaching basic dog training to other neighborhood families. Several veterans in the community had dogs with behavioral issues from shelter backgrounds, and Ezra's expertise helped transform them into well-adjusted companions.
After the break-in attempt, Bethany and Richard Crow stood before a federal judge in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. Their attorney had advised them to take a plea deal. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Video footage, financial records, emails, journal entries, witness testimony from multiple victims, and the physical evidence from the attempted framing. A trial would have been a massacre, legally speaking, and the sentences after a conviction would have been substantially harsher. Bethany pleaded guilty to wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and housing discrimination. Richard pleaded guilty to wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted evidence tampering. In exchange for their guilty pleas, several lesser charges were dropped, but the core crimes remained. The sentencing hearing was attended by dozens of Willowbrook Estates residents, including Ezra and Carmen. Several victims were given the opportunity to make impact statements, and the judge listened carefully to each one. Harold went first, speaking about how Bethany's harassment had made him feel unsafe in his own home for the first time in his 72 years. "I served in Vietnam," he said quietly. "I've faced enemy fire, but nothing made me feel as powerless as being targeted by someone who was supposed to be a community leader. She stole my money, my peace of mind, and my sense of security. I hope this sentence sends a message that vulnerable people, especially veterans, cannot be exploited without consequences." Captain Marcus Johnson appeared via video link from his current duty station. "My wife was 7 months pregnant when Mrs. Crow filed a false CPS report against us. The stress of that investigation, on top of everything else, contributed to complications with the pregnancy. Our daughter was born premature and spent 3 weeks in the NICU. I was deployed and couldn't be there. Mrs. Crow did that to us deliberately, knowing my wife was alone and vulnerable. That's not just fraud, that's cruelty." Carmen spoke about the impact on Sophie and Emma, how her daughters had nightmares about being taken away from their family, how they'd been bullied at school because of Mrs. Crow's rumors. "My children are 8 years old," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "They should have been excited about their new home and new school. Instead, they learned that sometimes adults lie. Sometimes authorities can't protect you, and sometimes the person who's supposed to be a leader is actually a predator. Those are hard lessons for children so young." When it was Ezra's turn, he kept his statement brief and focused. "Your Honor, I spent 22 years in the military protecting people's rights and freedoms. I investigated crimes and held people accountable. What Mrs. Crow did was not just steal money. She weaponized the systems that are supposed to protect us. The HOA, the police, child services, even the schools. She targeted military families specifically because she thought we'd be too transient, too stressed, too stretched thin to fight back. She was wrong, and I hope this case shows other veterans that when someone targets them, they have the right and the ability to fight back within the law." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Ellen Richardson, listened to every statement. When it came time for sentencing, she pulled no punches. "Mrs. Crow," Judge Richardson said, looking directly at Bethany, "you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that trust in the most egregious ways possible. You didn't just steal money, though that alone would be serious. You systematically targeted military service members and their families, people who have sacrificed for this country, and you exploited them for personal profit. You filed false reports with law enforcement and child protective services, wasting resources and traumatizing innocent families. You attempted to frame a decorated veteran as a terrorist. The cruelty and calculation involved in your crimes is breathtaking." Bethany's attorney tried to interject, mentioning her lack of prior criminal history and her contributions to the community, but Judge Richardson held up a hand. "Counselor, I've read the pre-sentencing report. I'm aware that Mrs. Crow has no prior convictions, but these crimes weren't committed in a moment of weakness or desperation.
They were carried out systematically, over years, with planning and premeditation. The journal entries alone demonstrate a level of malicious intent that I rarely see in this courtroom.
She turned her attention to Richard. "Mr. Crow, you enabled and profited from your wife's scheme. You were a willing participant in the real estate fraud, and you participated in the attempted evidence planting. You may not have been the architect of this conspiracy, but you were an enthusiastic accomplice." Judge Richardson reviewed the sentencing guidelines, the aggravating factors, and the need for deterrence. Then she delivered the sentences. "Bethany Crow, you are sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $155,000 to the victims of your fraud. You are permanently barred from serving in any HOA or community organization leadership position." Richard Crow, you are sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are jointly and severally liable for the restitution payment with your wife. Pinnacle Property Investments is to be dissolved, and its assets are to be liquidated to satisfy the restitution order. Bethany collapsed in her chair, sobbing. Richard sat stone-faced, staring at nothing. Their attorney made a note to file an appeal, though everyone in the courtroom knew it would be futile given the plea agreement. As the marshals led Bethany and Richard away, Ezra took Carmen to his hand. They watched the couple who had tried to destroy their family being taken into custody and felt not triumph but relief. It was finally over. The president, who thought she was untouchable, is currently serving her sentence in federal prison. Richard is in a different facility, serving his own time. Both will be released eventually, but their lives as they knew them are over. Their reputation is destroyed, their business is dissolved, and they're permanently barred from positions of trust in any community organization. Meanwhile, Willowbrook Estates has become stronger than ever. The community that was once terrorized by corruption has transformed itself into a model of transparency, support, and military family advocacy. The Veterans Resource Center serves dozens of families every month, and the neighborhood has become known as one of the most military-friendly communities in Virginia. Ezra still walks Rex and Luna every evening, but now neighbors wave and stop to chat instead of avoiding him. His daughters are thriving in school. Carmen's work at the Resource Center has earned her recognition from veteran advocacy groups, and the community they almost left has become the home they always hoped for. The lesson here? Corruption thrives in silence and fear. But when good people stand up, document the evidence, use the legal system properly, and support each other, even the most entrenched corruption can be defeated. Bethany Crow thought she was smart enough to get away with her scheme. She forgot that veterans and their families are trained to be vigilant, disciplined, and persistent. She forgot that when you target people who have faced down much worse than an abusive HOA president, they're not going to be easily intimidated. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Have you ever dealt with a corrupt HOA? How did you handle it? And remember, if you ever find yourself in a situation like this, document everything. Know your legal rights, and don't be afraid to fight back within the system. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay strong. And remember, justice might be slow, but when it comes, it's worth the wait.